Despite America's military power, Iran remains one of the hardest countries to stop. There is a question that has haunted American foreign policy for more than 4 decades, a question that has outlasted presidents, outlasted wars, outlasted sanctions, and outlasted every strategy Washington has thrown at it. The question is deceptively simple. Why, with the most powerful military in the history of human civilization, with an economy that dwarfs Iran's by a factor of nearly 30, with alliances stretching across every continent, can the United States not simply stop Iran, not contain it, not slow it down, not negotiate around it, stop it, completely and permanently? The honest answer, one that military strategists, diplomats, and intelligence analysts have wrestled with for years, is that the question itself rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works in the modern world, and of what Iran actually is. Iran is not a conventional adversary. It never has been. From the moment the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah in 1979 and Ayatollah Khomeini declared a new kind of state, one built not on nationalism alone, but on ideology, theology, and an explicit rejection of American-led world order, Iran positioned itself as a different kind of problem. Not a problem that could be solved with aircraft carriers or cruise missiles. Not a problem that diplomacy alone could dissolve. A problem that is, in many ways, a mirror held up to the limits of American power itself. To understand why America cannot fully stop Iran, you have to start not with weapons or military doctrine, but with geography. Iran sits at one of the most strategically consequential pieces of real estate on the planet. It borders the Persian Gulf to the south, the Caspian Sea to the north, Iraq to the west, Afghanistan and Pakistan to the east, and Turkey and Azerbaijan at its corners. It is not a country you can simply isolate. It is a country that, by its very physical existence, touches almost every major fault line in the Middle East and Central Asia simultaneously. And at its southwestern tip lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow channel of water, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which approximately 20% of all the oil traded in the world must pass. 20%. That single waterway connects the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, and Qatar to the economies of Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Iran sits on one side of it, and Iran has made abundantly clear, for decades, that any serious military confrontation comes with the implicit threat of closing that strait. When the 2026 war between the United States, Israel, and Iran began in earnest, Iran did exactly that. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. Global oil prices spiked, stock markets convulsed, shipping companies halted operations. And suddenly, the rest of the world, countries with no dog in the fight, no interest in Iranian nuclear policy or American geopolitics, found themselves hostage to a conflict they wanted no part of. That is Iranian leverage in its purest form. Geography transformed into coercive power, but geography is only the beginning. The deeper reason America cannot stop Iran lies in how Iran has chosen to fight. Since the early 1980s, Iran has been building what it calls the axis of resistance, a vast, sprawling network of allied militia groups, political movements, and armed factions spread across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, and beyond. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Kataib Hezbollah, and dozens of other Shia militia groups in Iraq, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. These are not merely Iranian puppets. They are deeply rooted in their own societies, with their own grievances, their own political bases, their own sources of funding and recruitment. Iran did not create the conditions that gave rise to them. It found those conditions and cultivated them, funded them, armed them, trained them, and wove them into a coherent regional strategy. The result was a network that allowed Tehran to project power across the entire Middle East without ever putting Iranian soldiers in the front line. It was genius. In a deeply troubling way, Iran could bleed its adversaries, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, through 1,000 cuts from a dozen directions, while maintaining official deniability and keeping its own territory and population out of the direct line of fire. For decades, that strategy worked almost perfectly. Every time the United States struck at one node in the network, the others adapted. When Israel and the United States assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the legendary commander of the IRGC Quds Force, in January 2020, there was a brief moment of hope in Washington that the network might unravel. It didn't. The proxies mourned, regrouped, and continued. New commanders emerged. The funding kept flowing. The ideology that bound these groups, resistance to American imperialism and Israeli occupation, proved more durable than any individual leader. Soleimani was irreplaceable in personal terms, but the system he had built was designed to outlast him. This is what Brookings Institution analysts have described as the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. For Iran, chaos and persistent pressure on Israel and the United States constitutes a victory in itself. Iran doesn't have to win. It just has to keep the fire burning. By the time the 2026 war began, the axis of resistance was already considerably weaker than it had been at its peak. The October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel and the devastating Israeli response had gutted Gaza. Hezbollah, once the crown jewel of Iran's proxy empire, had been badly damaged in the 2024 war, and again in Israel's 12-day campaign in 2025. Syria's Assad had fallen, snapping the land bridge that Iran used to supply Hezbollah with weapons and cash. The Houthis in Yemen, after months of Red Sea attacks, had been significantly degraded by American and British airstrikes. On paper, Iran was weaker than it had been in a generation. And yet, when the United States and Israel launched their strikes on February 28, 2026, the network did not simply collapse. Iraqi Shia militias struck American bases across the region. Hezbollah, even in its diminished state, launched rockets into northern Israel and forced Israeli air campaigns across Lebanon. The Houthis, despite everything, remained capable of threatening shipping. What analysts at the Institute for National Security Studies described as a network that was diminished but not defeated proved to be exactly that: diminished, dangerous, and maddeningly difficult to fully neutralize. There is something deeper at work here than military logistics. Iran's proxy strategy exploits a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Decentralized networks are extraordinarily difficult to defeat. The United States military is optimized for confronting state-based adversaries: armies with command structures, air forces with fixed bases, navies with identifiable fleets. Against such opponents, American military power is genuinely overwhelming. But Iran's axis of resistance is not a conventional military. It is a distributed organism with no single center. Destroy one part and the others adapt. Kill the leaders and new ones emerge from communities that have been fighting for generations. Cut off funding and new sources appear: drug trafficking, local taxation, patronage networks, diaspora remittances. This is why even the most sophisticated military in the world finds itself struggling against groups that operate on a fraction of its budget, with weapons that cost pennies compared to the interceptor missiles needed to shoot them down. The nuclear dimension adds another layer of complexity that may ultimately be the most consequential. For years, American policy was premised on preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was the most serious attempt to do this through diplomacy, a painstaking agreement that froze key elements of Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. When the Trump administration withdrew from the deal in 2018, the stated logic was that a better, more comprehensive deal could be achieved through maximum pressure. What actually happened was that Iran, freed from its commitments under the JCPOA, began advancing its nuclear program at a pace it never could have under the agreement. By 2025, Iran had enriched uranium to 60% purity, far beyond the 3.67% allowed under the 2015 deal, and approaching weapons-grade levels. The maximum pressure campaign, by any honest accounting, made Iran's nuclear program more advanced, not less. When the 2026 military strikes destroyed much of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, they created a new and perhaps more dangerous problem. Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium was buried in locations that could not be fully confirmed or reached. And the institutional knowledge, the scientists, the engineering expertise, none of that was destroyed. Iran's capacity to reconstitute its nuclear program, once the immediate military pressure lifted, remained intact in ways that deeply concern intelligence analysts. The Islamabad negotiations, mediated by Pakistan in the spring of 2026, revealed the full depth of the impasse. The United States demanded that Iran abandon all uranium enrichment for at least 20 years and surrender its existing stockpile. Iran's position was that enrichment is a legal right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a right it had every reason to exercise, and that demanding its abandonment was tantamount to demanding surrender as the price for ending a war that Iran argued America had started. There is a kind of brutal logic to the Iranian position that is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but impossible to dismiss. The United States withdrew from the one agreement that had successfully constrained Iran's nuclear ambitions, escalated to military strikes, and then demanded Iran give up more than the original deal required. From Tehran's perspective, compliance would simply invite the next round of pressure. From Washington's perspective, anything less than zero enrichment left the door open to an Iranian nuclear weapon. Both positions have internal coherence. Neither leaves room for compromise. And so the negotiations dragged on, fragile, inconclusive, shadowed by a ceasefire that both sides accused each other of violating. The geopolitical context matters enormously here, because Iran does not stand alone in the international system. China and Russia have both provided Iran with diplomatic cover at the United Nations, vetoing resolutions that would have imposed additional pressure. China, which imports significant quantities of Iranian oil despite American sanctions, has a direct economic interest in keeping Iran functional as a state and as an energy supplier. Russia, bogged down in Ukraine and increasingly isolated from the Western-led international order, sees Iran as a useful partner in its broader project of challenging American global primacy. Neither China nor Russia wants to see Iran develop nuclear weapons, but neither is willing to be the instrument of American policy in constraining Tehran. This gives Iran a degree of international protection that smaller or less strategically positioned adversaries have lacked. North Korea provides perhaps the most instructive parallel. A rogue state under crushing sanctions, with an active nuclear program sustained by Chinese tolerance and Russian indifference, that has defied American pressure for 3 decades. Iran is larger, wealthier, more educated, and more geopolitically significant than North Korea. If anything, it is harder to isolate. And then there is the domestic dimension, the question of what Iran actually is from the inside. American strategy has frequently been premised, at least implicitly, on the idea that the Iranian people can be turned against their own government, that enough economic pressure, enough support for protesters, enough visible solidarity with ordinary Iranians will eventually produce regime change from within. The 2025-2026 period provided a brutal test of that theory. When economic collapse following the 12-day war with Israel drove Iranians into the streets in mass protests, the United States publicly encouraged those protests and warned the regime against violence. The regime cracked down anyway, killing tens of thousands according to Iran's own Ministry of Health. The protests did not produce regime change. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, remained loyal to the system. The deep state of the Islamic Republic, the interlocking network of military, religious, economic, and intelligence institutions that has governed Iran for nearly 50 years, proved more resilient than any model based on popular anger could have predicted. This resilience points to something that American policymakers have consistently underestimated. The Islamic Republic is not simply a dictatorship maintained by fear. It has genuine constituencies. The IRGC is not just an army, it is an economic empire, controlling vast sectors of the Iranian economy, employing millions of people, providing livelihoods and status to a significant portion of the population. The religious establishment, while increasingly unpopular among urban, educated Iranians, remains powerful in rural areas and among the pious poor who see the revolution as their revolution, their liberation from a Shah who served foreign interests. The ideology of resistance, the idea that Iran stands up to the great powers where Arab states have capitulated, has genuine emotional resonance, even among Iranians who despise the regime's corruption and brutality. You cannot bomb an ideology into submission. You cannot sanction an identity out of existence. These are the hardest lessons of American engagement in the Middle East, and they apply with full force to Iran. What does American military victory over Iran actually look like? This is the question that, when pressed seriously, reveals the limits of the entire enterprise. Destroying nuclear facilities is achievable and was largely done in the 2026 strikes. Degrading missile and drone capabilities is achievable and was done. Sinking most of the Iranian Navy, as happened in the 2026 campaign, is achievable. But none of these things constitute stopping Iran. Iran retains the knowledge to rebuild. It retains territory, population, institutions, and the will to reconstitute its capabilities. A ground invasion that overthrew the Islamic Republic entirely would require an occupation force of a scale the United States has shown itself unwilling and unable to sustain. The Iraq experience, which cost trillions of dollars, thousands of American lives, and produced a country now substantially under Iranian influence, stands as the starkest possible warning against that approach. Regime change from within, as the 2025-2026 protest cycle demonstrated, cannot be reliably engineered from outside. And a negotiated settlement requires both sides to agree on terms, which means accepting that Iran retains some version of the capabilities and influence that America finds intolerable. The 2026 war has produced a situation that military strategists describe as strategic constraint rather than victory. Iran's capabilities have been severely degraded. Its proxy network is fractured. Its economy is in ruins. Its new leadership faces a period of profound uncertainty. But the Islamic Republic survives. The Strait of Hormuz remains an Iranian card to play. The enriched uranium stockpile, wherever it is, still exists. The scientists still live. The ideology still breathes. And Iran, as it has done after every previous confrontation, will begin the slow process of rebuilding, adapting its strategies, dispersing its capabilities more widely, drawing on Russian and Chinese support, and waiting for the moment when American attention shifts, as it always eventually does, to the next crisis. This is perhaps the most fundamental reason America cannot fully stop Iran: time. The United States operates on electoral cycles of 4 years, budget cycles of 1 year, and news cycles measured in hours. Iran has been playing the same strategic game for nearly 50 years across multiple supreme leaders, multiple American presidents, multiple rounds of sanctions and military strikes and negotiations. Iranian strategic culture is steeped in a sense of civilizational time that makes American impatience look like a character flaw. Persia was a great power for millennia before the United States existed. The Islamic Republic's leaders genuinely believe they are engaged in a struggle that will outlast any individual administration in Washington. And history, frustratingly, has given them reason to believe they are right. None of this is to say that Iran is invincible, or that American policy is futile, or that the Islamic Republic's vision for the region is somehow legitimate or beneficial. The axis of resistance has brought enormous suffering to the peoples of Lebanon, Yemen, Gaza, Syria, and Iraq. The Iranian regime has brutalized its own people with a ferocity that should not be minimized or excused. The nuclear ambitions of a regime that openly calls for the elimination of Israel represent a genuine danger that the world cannot simply ignore. The question is not whether Iran is a threat. The question is whether the tools America has reached for, maximum pressure, military strikes, regime change theory, are actually capable of producing the outcome America wants. The evidence of the past 4 decades, and the events of 2025 and 2026 in particular, suggests that they are not. What they produce instead is a cycle: pressure, resistance, escalation, stalemate, temporary accommodation, rebuilding, and pressure again. Breaking that cycle would require a different kind of thinking, one that accepts Iran as a permanent geopolitical reality with legitimate interests that must be accommodated even as its most dangerous ambitions are. Constrained, that invests as seriously in soft power and regional development as in military capability, that builds a diplomatic architecture broad enough to include China and Russia, rather than simply confronting them as obstacles. It would require patience measured in decades, not election cycles. It would require the United States to accept that full victory. Iran completely stopped, its influence eliminated, its nuclear program abolished, its proxies disbanded, is simply not available at any price America is willing or able to pay. The alternative that is available is a managed, imperfect equilibrium that prevents the worst outcomes while accepting that Iran will remain a difficult, dangerous, and influential power in a region where it has been a major force for 3,000 years. What makes this particularly painful to reckon with is that the United States has, at various moments, come very close to a different kind of relationship with Iran. In 2015, when the JCPOA was signed after years of painstaking negotiation, there was a genuine belief among many analysts that a new chapter was possible, that economic integration, the return of Iranian students and businesses to the global economy, and the normalization of diplomatic contact could gradually shift the incentives facing Iranian leaders. That belief was never fully tested. The agreement held for 3 years. Iran complied with its terms, and the centrifuges slowed. Then the withdrawal came, and with it, the proof, from Tehran's perspective, that American commitments cannot be trusted across administrations. That lesson, that any deal with Washington is only as durable as the current occupant of the White House, has now been burned into Iranian strategic thinking so deeply that even those within Iran who might favor accommodation with the West find their arguments undermined by recent history. Why sign an agreement that the next president might tear up the moment the political winds shift? This credibility problem extends beyond Iran. Every country watching the cycle of American pressure and reversal on Iran draws its own conclusions about the durability of American commitments. North Korea has drawn the conclusion that only nuclear weapons provide genuine security against American regime change ambitions. Other regional powers have drawn the conclusion that hedging between Washington and Beijing is wiser than exclusive alignment with either. The failure to stop Iran is not merely a bilateral problem. It radiates outward, shaping calculations in capitals from Riyadh to Islamabad to Seoul. There is also the question of what stopping Iran would actually require in human terms, and whether American society has the appetite for it. The Iraq War, launched to eliminate weapons of mass destruction that did not exist, cost approximately 4,500 American lives, and, by some estimates, more than 100,000 Iraqi civilian deaths, displaced millions of people, and spent somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion, and produced a country that today serves as one of Iran's most significant spheres of influence. If the United States could not pacify a country of 40 million people on Iran's western border, the prospect of fundamentally transforming a country of 90 million people with a stronger national identity, deeper institutional roots, and a mountain range that makes Iraq's terrain look flat should give pause to even the most confident advocate of military force. The human geography of Iran matters too. Iran is not a country at war with itself in the way that might make foreign intervention manageable. It is a country with real internal tensions between reformists and hardliners, between the urban professional class and the rural religious poor, between Persian majority and ethnic minorities, between those who want integration with the world and those who see isolation as identity. But these tensions have not produced the kind of structural fracture that typically precedes state collapse. The Islamic Republic has spent 50 years building institutions that are brittle in some ways, but surprisingly durable in others. Its weakness is economic. Its strength is institutional depth and ideological coherence among the core constituencies that matter most for regime survival. That is not a satisfying conclusion. It is not the kind of thing that plays well in press conferences or campaign rallies, but it is the conclusion that the facts demand. And the sooner American strategy is built around what is actually achievable rather than what is rhetorically satisfying, the sooner the cycle of escalation and disappointment might finally begin to slow. Iran cannot be fully stopped, but it can, with the right combination of pressure and engagement, be sufficiently constrained that the region and the world are safer than they would be under continued cycles of escalation. That is the real choice before American policymakers, not victory or defeat, but wisdom or repetition.